Hi, my name is Danays, and I'm an educator here at HistoryMiami Museum. And today we're going to talk about the Mariel Boatlift of 1980. This year, 2020, marks the 40th anniversary of the Mariel Boatlift. Now, before we start talking about the largest exodus of Cubans within a year span, we need to take a step back to 1959. Dictator Fidel Castro came into power in 1959. His reign would cause waves of Cuban migration to Miami for the rest of the century. In Castro's regime, citizens' ability to own and run your private businesses was made illegal. Political opponents were jailed, and many oppositional newspapers were shut down. This forced many upper and middle class professionals and skilled craft workers to migrate to the U.S. This first wave was known as the Golden Exile. Then, in 1960 through 1962, the U.S. Department of State and the Catholic Charities of Miami teamed up to bring 14,000 unaccompanied children into Miami. It was the largest recorded child refugee exodus, called Operation Pedro Pan. Through the operation came Willie Chirino and MDC's former president, Eduardo J. Padron. The next wave was the 1965-1973 migration called the Freedom Flights, or Los Vuelos de la Libertad. Flights leaving Cuba for Miami were filled with Cuban hopefuls who had added their name to a wait list with over 1 million people for the opportunity to board that flight. While waiting, these citizens who applied faced harassment. They were fired from their jobs or harassed by neighbors who were on the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, known as CDR. Some citizens were in internment camps, working in fields far from home, awaiting their chance at freedom. The Freedom Flights brought over 250,000 Cubans to Miami within an 8-year period, a relatively slow pace for what Miami experienced in the summer of 1980. The mass exodus of 125,000 people began with just 5 individuals led by Hector Sanustis, who used a public bus to knock down the fence at the Peruvian embassy in Havana, Cuba, on April 1st, 1980. Although they had just been bombarded, the Peruvian embassy allowed the 5 asylum seekers to stay. The Castro regime was not happy about this, as it would give other Cubans the unwanted idea of seeking asylum status through the other embassies on the island. Seeing that Peru was not going to turn in the 5 asylum seekers to be imprisoned, a half-mile perimeter was set up around the embassy with Cuban guards. However, this only lasted 4 days because the Castro regime decided to withdraw security forces on April 4th, with the hopes that the citizens who had been turned away would return and overwhelm the facility, forcing Peru to abandon aid. Sure enough, as word spread throughout the western part of the island, people began flooding the embassy. By April 5th, 2,000 people had entered the embassy, which was made up of 2 two-story buildings and a large garden area. This is where most of the asylum seekers slept and lived. It was overcrowded, to say the least. It was not designed to house 10,000 people, which it had by April 6. With overcrowding, hygienic conditions at the embassy were quickly deteriorating. The Peruvian government had to figure out a solution to this overwhelming humanitarian crisis. They began by contacting other countries that would accept refugees. Costa Rica, Spain, Venezuela, and the United States under President Jimmy Carter's administration were some of the countries who agreed to take in refugees. President Carter arranged an immigration registration center in Costa Rica in hopes of controlling the influx of refugees. As these countries sorted out the details of the crisis, unrest started amongst the people in Cuba. Those seeking asylum were labeled as traitors or gusanos, a worm. The protests made it dangerous for those who had passes to go to and from the embassy to their homes. Some even found their home destroyed, and others found their power lines had been cut. With unrest amongst the people growing and countries still figuring out the details of immigration and asylum status, the efforts to organize entry turned out to be in vain. On April 20th, the Castro regime decided to open up the Mariel harbor and announced to the Cuban exiles living in the United States that they were welcome to enter the port and take their family back home with them. Marinas began to empty, people drove down to Key West and began buying or chartering boats and fishing vessels to get their families home as quickly as possible. Cuban guards were set up at the port and instructed to load as many passengers as possible, ignoring the max capacity. They were loading up people who had been at the embassy and worked on retrieving Cubans throughout the island whose family had come for them. These families had to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. The Castro regime took the incoming boats as an opportunity to load people from Cuba's prisons. Although not every prisoner was a criminal, some of these prisoners were imprisoned for simply expressing dissent towards the government, attempting to leave the country illegally, or others were imprisoned for being queer or disabled. Also, patients from the psychiatric facility Mazorra were taken out of care and put into boats headed to the U.S. The U.S. Coast Guard was in charge of protecting these refugee vessels, as many of the older boats would experience mechanical failures and end up stranded out at sea. The Coast Guard would be tasked with rescue missions, disembarking overcrowded boats, and of course towing those stranded boats. By April 28th, Monroe and Dade County had received 15,761 refugees, causing then-Governor Bob Graham to declare a state of emergency. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, better known as FEMA, was dispatched to organize the influx of refugees, focusing their efforts on getting refugees off the island of Key West. Temporary housing stations were set up at Trumbull Point in Key West, at the Orange Bowl Stadium, now known as the Marlins Stadium in Little Havana, and under Interstate 95 in downtown, which became known as Tent City. The Miami community came together and donated hygienic supplies, food, and volunteered their time in an effort to prepare the refugees for their next steps. For some who arrived completely undocumented, their journey to freedom in the form of a residential status would be months away. But once released, they would be entering Cuban communities that had been in the making since the 1960s. By October 1980, the U.S. and Cuban government had come to an agreement to end the exodus. As we look back on the Mariel Boatlift, those individuals that took a chance and came with little to no items on overcrowded boats for a chance towards freedom will never forget their journey. From refugee status to citizenship, the Mariel refugees went on to enrich Miami's neighborhoods and create homes for themselves here in Miami as well as other parts of the country. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Inside the Museum. We hope to see you in the next one.